Daniel Carter never imagined that the crooked little birdhouse he built with his daughter on a quiet Saturday afternoon would make the most powerful woman in the state pull her car to the side of the road and cry so hard she couldn't breathe. To Daniel, it was nothing more than a small promise kept, a way to make his 9-year-old daughter smile after a year that had taken almost everything from them. But to the billionaire watching from across the street, it was a moment that reopened a wound she had spent 5 years trying to bury under money, success, and endless work. Sometimes the smallest acts of love carry the heaviest weight, and sometimes the people watching from a distance are carrying grief so deep that a simple birdhouse can shatter the walls they built around their hearts. The Carter house sat at the end of Maple Street in a quiet suburb just outside Columbus, Ohio, the kind of neighborhood where the lawns were uneven, the fences leaned a little to the left, and most of the houses had stories written into their peeling paint and weathered porches. Daniel Carter stood in the middle of his small backyard early that Saturday morning, holding a piece of old scrap what he had pulled from the garage, while his daughter Lily bounced excitedly beside him like she had just discovered treasure. At 38 years old, Daniel had the tired eyes of someone who had been fighting life longer than he expected. His dark hair had begun to gray near the temples, and the calluses on his hands told the story of a man who worked too many hours for too little money. But when he looked down at Lily, the exhaustion softened into something warmer. She was 9 years old, with messy brown hair that refused to stay tied back and bright green eyes that reminded him painfully of her mother. Emily Carter had been the kind of woman who filled every room with laughter, the kind of person who believed life was meant to be built slowly with love and patience, like one of the handmade projects she insisted on doing every weekend. 2 years earlier, a sudden illness had taken her away in the span of 3 months, leaving Daniel alone with a mortgage he could barely afford, a house that constantly needed repairs, and a daughter who still sometimes asked questions about heaven in the middle of the night. Since then, Daniel had taken every extra shift he could find as a delivery driver, often leaving before sunrise and returning home long after Lily had finished her homework at the kitchen table. The backyard had slowly fallen into disrepair during those months. The fence sagged near the corner, the flower beds were mostly weeds now, and the old oak tree in the center of the yard had dropped enough branches to fill half the garage. But Lily didn't see the broken pieces of their life the way Daniel did. To her, the backyard was still a place for adventures, a place where birds gathered every morning and squirrels chased each other along the fence like tiny acrobats. That morning she had burst out of the house holding a cracked wooden plank she found behind a stack of paint cans. "Daddy, look what I found," she announced proudly, holding it up like it was a priceless artifact. Daniel wiped grease from his hands with an old rag and studied the piece of wood. It was rough, uneven, and probably left over from a project he and Emily had started years ago but never finished. Before he could say anything, Lily tilted her head and asked the question that would change everything. "Can we build something for the birds?" she said. Daniel glanced up at the oak tree where 2 sparrows were hopping along a branch, chirping at each other like they were having a heated conversation. For a moment he hesitated. His to-do list for the day was long. The porch railing needed fixing. The car was making a strange grinding noise, and he still had paperwork to fill out before his night shift. But then he remembered something Emily used to say whenever he tried to rush through the weekends. "The house can wait," she would laugh, pulling him towards some half-finished craft project. Childhood can't. Daniel looked back at Lily, whose hopeful eyes were already imagining something wonderful made from that crooked piece of wood. He smiled despite the fatigue in his bones. "All right," he said. "Let's build a birdhouse." Lily's excitement exploded instantly. She ran into the garage and began dragging out tools that were almost as big as she was, including a small hammer and a box of nails that rattled like tiny maracas. The project quickly turned into the kind of chaotic construction site that would have made a professional carpenter cringe. Daniel measured pieces of wood while Lily held the tape measure crookedly. Nails bent sideways. Boards didn't quite line up. At one point the roof slanted so badly Daniel had to pull 3 nails out and start again while Lily giggled uncontrollably. But slowly, piece by piece, the shape of a birdhouse began to emerge. It wasn't perfect. The entrance hole was slightly off-center, and one of the sides had a crack running along the grain of the wood. But when Lily stepped back and placed her hands on her hips, she looked at it like they had just built a castle. "It needs color," she declared seriously. She disappeared into the garage again and returned with an old set of paint cans Emily had once used for craft projects. Soon the birdhouse was covered in bright blue paint, yellow flowers, and little red hearts that dripped slightly down the sides. Daniel lifted Lily onto his shoulders so she could nail the finished birdhouse to the trunk of the oak tree. Her small hands trembled with concentration as she tapped the final nail into place. When he set her back down and they stepped away together, the crooked little house hung proudly from the tree branch. For a moment nothing happened. Then a small brown sparrow fluttered down and perched on the edge of the tiny entrance hole. Lily gasped like she had just witnessed magic. "Daddy, it's already working," she shouted, clapping her hands. Daniel laughed, the sound fuller than it had been in months. What he didn't notice was the black SUV parked quietly across the street. Inside the vehicle sat Victoria Hale, one of the wealthiest women in America, watching the scene unfold through the tinted window. She had originally stopped to take a phone call from one of her executives about a billion-dollar deal. But somewhere between Lily's laughter and the moment Daniel lifted his daughter onto his shoulders, Victoria had forgotten the phone entirely. Because 5 years earlier, her son had asked her the exact same question Lily had asked that morning. "Mom, can we build a birdhouse together?" And Victoria had answered the same way she always did. Next weekend, as she watched the crooked little birdhouse hanging from the tree, Victoria felt something inside her chest crack open. And for the first time in years, the billionaire who owned half the companies in the world found herself sitting alone in a parked car, wiping tears from her eyes while a father and daughter celebrated the smallest victory imaginable. Victoria Hale sat motionless inside the black SUV long after Daniel and Lily had gone back inside their small house, her eyes still fixed on the crooked little birdhouse swaying gently from the oak tree, because what she had just witnessed from across the street was something she had spent the last 5 years trying desperately to forget. The world knew Victoria Hale as the brilliant and relentless tech billionaire who had built one of the fastest-growing artificial intelligence companies in America, a woman whose decisions could move stock markets and whose name appeared regularly on magazine covers beside words like visionary, genius, and unstoppable. But sitting there in the quiet neighborhood on Maple Street, none of that power seemed to matter. Her driver, Marcus, glanced at her in the rearview mirror after several minutes of silence. "Ma'am," he said gently, "do you still want me to head to the office?" Victoria didn't answer right away. Her eyes remained locked on the small wooden birdhouse, painted bright blue with yellow flowers and clumsy red hearts. It leaned slightly to one side, its roof uneven and its paint already smudged in places. But to her it looked more valuable than any of the million-dollar sculptures displayed inside her penthouse gallery. Finally she spoke, her voice quiet and distant. "Drive around the block," she said. Marcus nodded and slowly pulled the SUV away from the curb. But Victoria kept twisting in her seat until the oak tree disappeared from view. The moment the house was gone, the memory she had been trying to hold back finally rushed in. 5 years earlier, her life had looked very different. Back then, Victoria had still been racing to build her company into a global empire. Her schedule had been an endless blur of board meetings, investor calls, international flights, and product launches. Her 10-year-old son Noah used to wait patiently in the living room of their glass-walled California mansion, drawing pictures while she worked late into the night. Noah was a quiet boy with curious eyes and a habit of asking questions about everything. One afternoon he had run into her office holding a small instruction booklet from a craft kit his grandfather had mailed him. "Mom," he had said excitedly, "look, Grandpa sent a birdhouse kit. Can we build it together this weekend?" Victoria had barely looked up from her laptop screen. A major product launch was coming up, and she was rehearsing a presentation that investors around the world would be watching. Without thinking, she smiled distractedly and said the word she always used when work felt too urgent to pause. "Next weekend, buddy." Noah had nodded with the quiet patience he had inherited from his father. "Okay," he said, but the next weekend never came. Just 3 weeks later, Noah developed a sudden illness that doctors struggled to diagnose. Within 2 months, the boy who once filled their mansion with laughter was gone. In the years that followed, Victoria threw herself deeper into her company, building it into a $40 billion powerhouse. Money, success, and constant work became the walls she used to protect herself from grief. But there was one object she had never been able to throw away: The unfinished birdhouse kit Noah had left sitting on the dining room table. As Marcus drove the SUV slowly through the neighborhood, Victoria pressed her fingers against her temple as the memory tightened around her chest. "Ma'am," Marcus said carefully, "should I take you home?" Victoria stared out the window at the modest houses passing by. "Take me back," she whispered. 10 minutes later, the SUV quietly returned to Maple Street. Daniel and Lily were back in the yard again. This time Lily was holding a small plastic bowl filled with birdseed, while Daniel knelt beside the oak tree adjusting the nail that held the birdhouse in place. Victoria felt her throat tighten as she watched Daniel lift Lily into his arms so she could reach the opening and pour the seeds inside. "Careful," he told her, with a laugh. "Don't spill it all at once." Lily giggled. "I want the birds to invite their friends," she replied. Victoria felt tears sting her eyes again. Marcus noticed and quietly looked away, pretending to check something on the dashboard. The SUV remained parked there for nearly 20 minutes as Victoria watched the father and daughter talk, laugh, and feed the birds like it was the most important task in the world. Finally, Lily noticed the car. Children have a way of spotting things adults overlook, and she stared curiously at the unfamiliar vehicle across the street. "Daddy," she said, tugging on Daniel's sleeve. "There's someone watching us." Daniel turned and glanced toward the SUV. Victoria's heart jumped when their eyes met through the windshield. For a moment, she considered asking Marcus to drive away immediately, but something stopped her. Instead, she slowly opened the door and stepped out onto the sidewalk. Lily's curiosity immediately overcame any hesitation. She ran across the street before Daniel could stop her. "Hi," Lily said cheerfully. Victoria blinked in surprise at the sudden greeting. Up close, she could see how small the girl really was, with paint stains still on her fingers from the birdhouse project. "Hello," Victoria replied softly. Lily pointed proudly toward the oak tree behind her house. "Did you see our birdhouse?" she asked. Victoria nodded, her voice catching slightly. "Yes," she said. "It's beautiful." Lily beamed with pride. "We built it today." Daniel finally caught up and gently rested a hand on Lily's shoulder. "Sorry if she startled you," he said politely. "She's very enthusiastic." Victoria shook her head quickly. "No apology needed," she said. "I was just admiring your project." Lily leaned closer like she was sharing a secret. "The birds already like it," she whispered excitedly. One came right away. Victoria looked back at the oak tree where the crooked birdhouse swayed slightly in the breeze. Her chest tightened again as Noah's voice echoed in her memory, asking the same hopeful question he once had. "Mom, do birds really live in those?" She swallowed hard. "I'm sure they do," she told Lily gently. Lily nodded seriously. "Daddy says birds always find their way home," she added. The words hit Victoria like a wave. She turned away quickly, pretending to look at the houses down the street while tears gathered in her eyes. Daniel noticed the sudden shift in her expression but didn't ask questions. Something about the quiet sadness in her face told him there was a story behind it. After a moment, Victoria wiped her eyes and forced a small smile. "Well," she said softly, "I should let you get back to your afternoon." Lily waved enthusiastically as Victoria walked back to the SUV. But once she sat inside and the door closed, the tears she had been holding back finally spilled over. Marcus started the engine gently. "Where to now, ma'am?" Victoria stared out the window at the oak tree one last time before answering. "Home," she said. But as the car pulled away, she already knew something inside her had changed. Because the image of that crooked blue birdhouse hanging beside a laughing father and daughter was now something she couldn't stop thinking about. And the next morning, without telling anyone, Victoria Hale would find herself asking Marcus to drive back to Maple Street again. Victoria Hale barely slept that night, because every time she closed her eyes she saw the same image again and again. A crooked blue birdhouse hanging from an oak tree while a father lifted his daughter onto his shoulders so she could pour birdseed inside. It was such a small moment, something the rest of the world would have forgotten in seconds. But for Victoria, it felt like a door had opened to a memory she had spent years trying to seal shut. By sunrise, she was already standing in the kitchen of her enormous glass-walled mansion, staring at the unfinished wooden birdhouse kit that still sat on a shelf near the window. Dust had gathered on the box over the years, but she had never been able to throw it away. Noah's handwriting was still visible on the side in messy blue marker where he had written, "Build with Mom." Victoria reached out slowly and touched the lid of the box, her fingers trembling slightly. For 5 years, she had told herself that focusing on work was the only way to survive the loss of her son. She built companies, bought skyscrapers, and filled her schedule so tightly that there was never room for silence. But yesterday afternoon, watching Daniel and Lily laughing together in their backyard, something had cracked open inside her. It reminded her of a truth she had buried under endless meetings and billion-dollar deals. That time was the one thing even the richest person in the world could never buy back. By mid-morning, she had made a decision that surprised even herself. "Marcus," she said as she climbed into the back of the SUV again, holding a small wooden box carefully in her lap. "Take me back to Maple Street." When the car turned onto the quiet neighborhood road, Daniel Carter was outside repairing the loose section of his fence. The old wood creaked as he hammered a nail into place, while Lily sat cross-legged in the grass nearby, drawing pictures with colored chalk on a flat stone. The oak tree stood behind them like a quiet guardian, its branches swaying gently in the warm breeze, while the little blue birdhouse hung from its truck. As the black SUV pulled up along the curb, Lily immediately recognized it. She jumped to her feet and waved enthusiastically. "Daddy, it's the Birdhouse lady," she shouted. Daniel looked up, surprised, and watched as Victoria stepped out of the vehicle holding the small wooden box against her chest. She walked toward them slowly, her expression softer than it had been the day before. "Good morning," she said politely. Daniel wiped his hands on his jeans and nodded. "Morning," he replied. "Nice to see you again." Lily was already bouncing with curiosity. "Did you come to see the birds?" she asked eagerly. Victoria smiled faintly. "Something like that," she said. Then she gently opened the box she had been carrying. Inside was a small wooden birdhouse, perfectly crafted but clearly made by a child's hands. The paint was faded in places, and one corner of the roof had been glued back together. "My son built this with his grandfather," Victoria said quietly. Daniel noticed the way her voice softened when she said the word son, and he immediately understood the weight behind it. Lily leaned closer, studying the tiny house with fascination. "It's really pretty," she said. Victoria nodded slowly. "He wanted to hang it outside," she explained. "But we never got the chance." The yard fell silent for a moment as the meaning behind her words settled in the air. Daniel looked at the birdhouse, then at the oak tree behind them where Lily's crooked blue house hung proudly. Without asking any more questions, he simply pointed toward the tree. "You should put it there," he said gently. Victoria blinked in surprise. "Next to yours?" she asked. Lily clapped her hands excitedly before Daniel could answer. "Yes, then the birds can have neighbors," she said. A small laugh escaped Victoria's lips. Mixed with tears, she couldn't quite hold back. Daniel grabbed a hammer from his toolbox and handed it to her. "Here," he said. Victoria walked slowly to the oak tree, her heart pounding as she lifted the small wooden house toward the truck. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed the nail against the bark. Lily stood beside her, offering enthusiastic instructions. "Right there. That spot is perfect," she declared. With one careful tap after another, the birdhouse was secured to the tree just inches away from the crooked blue one. When Victoria stepped back, the two small houses hung side by side, one bright and uneven, the other older and gently worn. Almost as if on cue, a small sparrow fluttered down and perched between them. Lily gasped dramatically. "Look, they're already checking it out," she said. Daniel smiled, folding his arms as he watched the birds hop curiously between the two houses. Victoria stared at the scene, tears sliding quietly down her cheeks. For the first time in 5 years, the memory of Noah didn't feel like a crushing weight on her chest. Instead, it felt like something warmer, like a quiet presence standing beside her beneath the branches of that oak tree. "Thank you," she said softly. Daniel shrugged lightly. "Sometimes the little things matter most," he replied. Victoria stayed in the yard longer than she expected that afternoon. Lily insisted on showing her the chalk drawings she had made and explaining which birds usually visited the tree in the mornings. Daniel even brought out 3 glasses of lemonade, and they sat together on the old wooden steps of the porch talking about nothing important at all. But that simple afternoon planted an idea in Victoria's mind that would grow into something far bigger than she imagined. A week later, construction crews quietly arrived in the neighborhood. Broken sidewalks were repaired, streetlights replaced, and playground equipment installed in the nearby park. When reporters later asked Victoria Hale why she had suddenly donated millions of dollars to renovate struggling neighborhoods across the state, she simply gave a quiet answer. Because families deserve places where parents and children can build things together, she said. The project eventually became the Noah Hale Foundation, funding parks, playgrounds, and community workshops across the country where kids and parents could learn to build birdhouses, tree houses, and small wooden projects side by side. But despite all the attention and recognition the foundation received, Victoria never forgot the moment that started it all. Every few weeks, she returned quietly to Maple Street to visit the oak tree. By then, several birds had made homes in the two little houses hanging from its trunk. Lily liked to say they were running their own tiny neighborhood. And every time Victoria looked up at those two birdhouses swaying gently beside each other, she was reminded of something she had once forgotten in the rush to build an empire. That the most powerful thing in the world wasn't money, success, or fame. It was the simple act of showing up for the people who mattered, while there was still time to build something together.